Hey guys, in the news recently, we have seen a lot of reporting on the various protests happening around the country. The BLM and police reform protests reignited over the summer. Occasionally, these were accompanied by riots, but we often saw protesters being violently handled by the police or by the National Guard in some cases. Teachers in school districts across the nation are protesting unsafe conditions during this time of the COVID pandemic. New Orleans City Waste Union, so like the garbage collectors, went on strike also over the summer, demanding working conditions. And then the city decided to replace them with unpaid prison labor while they were on strike. This isn't new though, and today we are going to talk about four of the most influential strikes and protests of the Gilded Age. So remember that we are in the middle of the Gilded Age in our history studies. A select few people have amassed enormous wealth. 4,000 American families have more money than half of the country's 39 million people combined. We have our robber barons living large, building castles, throwing these massive parties. But it's not all gold. Behind the robber barons are millions of workers who are being mistreated. Some people are working up to 100 hours a week and earning less than $1 an hour. Children are working in factories and mines in dangerous conditions. Apartments are run down, overcrowded, and unsanitary in the cities. And further west, some entire towns are made up of tents or shacks. Eventually, the workers decide to unite for better working conditions, higher wages, and less hours and protections. They form these labor unions, they have strikes, and they have boycotts. They attempt to negotiate with the big bosses. But this is going to make that 1% of the richest people in the country really angry. After all, why would they want to pay workers more if you have people willing to do the job for $1 an hour? So, they start to do all sorts of things to put down any resistance and opposition to their shady business practices. The big bosses would shut down the factories entirely and lock out the workers. They might hire scabs, which are people who would come into the workplace and replace any of the workers that were on strike. Sometimes they hired these Pinkerton detectives, which was basically a private security company that did all sorts of illegal and terrible things like spying on the unions, beating people up, attacking strikers, things like that. And so, because of all of this, tension is starting to bubble up and violence starts to spill over at many of these strikes and protests. The first is going to be the Homestead strike in 1892, and it involves Andrew Carnegie, the steel robber baron that we talked about yesterday. His workers were asking for higher pay, so the factory locked them out and hired the scabs to come and do the work for them. They also brought in the Pinkerton detectives to guard the factory. There were a lot of clashes between the strikers and the Pinkertons. So then they call in the militia to stop the protests. A couple people die, a couple people are attacked, and eventually what happens is the union was spending so much money on these protests and on bailing people out of jail and on legal protections that they run out of money. And so the strike kind of just fizzles out in the end. And Andrew Carnegie kind of gets away with some things. The next is the Haymarket Riot, which happens a couple of years later in 1896 in Chicago. The workers at a factory in Chicago called the McCormick Reaper Company went on strike. Same thing, they want these higher wages, they want an 8-hour workday, and a lot of fights start breaking out between the strikers and the scabs. The protests go on into the night. There are speeches. The mayor comes out, and the mayor's like, okay, cool, that's fine. We'll let them express themselves. But the police end up attacking the protesters. There's a ton of police brutality. Some people get shot and killed. Somebody ends up throwing a bomb into the crowd. We're not sure which side threw the bomb out. But after all of this, 8 protest organizers are arrested and convicted of murder and doing the bomb, even though there was no evidence against them. And several of them, including the man making the speech right here, ends up getting executed in the end. Then we have the Pullman strike. This was a railroad company, and the company actually owned the entire town where all of the workers lived. So they go ahead and they decide to cut the wages of the workers and pay them less, but they left the rent in town as high as it ever had been. So this is in the middle of the Depression. People are really poor, really unable to survive, so the workers decide to go on strike. It gets super bloody. Protests end up spreading across the Midwest. The trains get stopped across the country. And eventually, the National Guard is sent in to quiet things down. Again, we have people being killed in a bunch of different cities across the Midwest. But because of the craziness that happens, the protest actually inspires the president of the time, Grover Cleveland, to create Labor Day as a national holiday, as sort of like an I'm sorry to the workers. But he doesn't actually enact any like serious, long lasting changes. And so finally, all the way in 1914, we have the Ludlow Massacre. And as we can tell by its name, it involves the murder of a lot of people. It also involves our other friendly robber baron, John D. Rockefeller. John D. had a coal mining town in Colorado. And even though he has $1 zillion, all of his workers are living in a tent city next to the mines. And so the workers go on strike. Rockefeller calls in the National Guard, who literally use machine guns to gun down all of the miners and their families. They burn the tents to the ground. A bunch of women, a bunch of children get killed. Like somewhere between 70 and 180 people are killed. And the country hears about this and is absolutely outraged. So, finally, Congress decides, okay, we have some issues. Enough is enough. They grow a backbone. They stop listening to the robber barons. They pass some laws that limit child labor, make an 8-hour workday. Years and years later, they make some more laws about a minimum wage. They ban monopolies. They ban some of this use of force. But as we can see from current events, this stuff is still happening even now. So that is today in the nutshell. Let's go ahead and get started on our lesson for today.